It was another sunny day at the Grand Royal Palace. Tourists crowded around the gates, their faces lit up with excitement. They had come from all over the world to see the famous palace, with its stunning architecture and the well-known royal guards. The guards, dressed in their perfect uniforms, stood still like statues. They were known for their discipline, never moving, no matter what happened around them. The air was warm, and the sound of chatter filled the atmosphere. People were taking pictures, laughing, and talking about their experiences. It was the kind of day where everyone seemed to be in a good mood, but little did they know, things were about to change. Among the crowd was Karen. She was in her mid-40s, with a bright red scarf around her neck and a pair of sunglasses that almost seemed too big for her face. Karen wasn't the type to quietly enjoy the surroundings. No, she was the kind of person who believed the world should revolve around her. And today, she was determined to make sure that everyone around her noticed her, especially the royal guards standing so still at attention. "I can't believe I'm standing here," Karen said loudly to her husband, who was trailing behind her with a camera in hand. "These guards are so boring. They're just standing there like statues. They should be doing something exciting. What a waste of time." Her words didn't go unnoticed. A few nearby tourists glanced over at her, some shaking their heads, but Karen was too busy making her way closer to the guards to notice. She pushed past a few people in the crowd, her heels clicking against the cobblestones as she made her way to the front. "Let's get a better view," she said, not waiting for anyone's response. Her husband sighed and followed her, holding the camera tightly. He wasn't as enthusiastic about getting a closer look at the guards, but didn't want to argue. As Karen stood near one of the guards, she could hardly contain her feelings of superiority. She looked at the tall, uniformed soldier in front of her, wondering how anyone could be so boring. The guard didn't even blink, standing there in his stiff posture like a piece of stone. Karen, feeling a strange urge to be noticed, waved her hand right in front of the guard's face. He didn't react, not even a flinch. Karen's eyebrows raised in surprise. She had expected at least some reaction, a little twitch of his eye or a slight movement, but nothing. The guard didn't move a muscle. "Hello, Earth to guard," Karen said loudly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Still, the guard remained unmoved. She frowned and looked around at the crowd. Some people were starting to laugh, but most just continued to watch, unaware of what was happening. Karen felt a little more confident. After all, who was this guard to ignore her? She was a paying visitor, and she wasn't going to stand by quietly while some soldier stood like a robot. She decided to try something else to get his attention. Karen stood there for a moment, watching the royal guard closely. She couldn't believe he wasn't reacting to her little hello. It was as if he didn't even notice she was standing right in front of him. Her frustration grew, and she thought to herself, "This is ridiculous. How can anyone be so stiff and unresponsive?" She turned to her husband, who was still standing behind her, holding the camera. "Can you believe this? Look at him, just standing there like he's made of stone. He's so rude," she said, her voice a little louder than before. Her husband, trying to avoid drawing more attention, muttered, "Karen, maybe you should just let it go. He's probably just doing his job." But Karen was determined to get a reaction. She wasn't about to let this guard ignore her. After all, she was a paying tourist, and she deserved some attention, didn't she? With a small smirk on her face, she stepped even closer to the guard, standing right in front of him. She looked up at his stiff face, but he didn't blink, didn't move a single muscle. His eyes stayed straight ahead, staring into the distance, focused on his duty. "Come on, you're really going to just stand there," Karen said loudly, tapping her foot impatiently. "Don't you know how to talk? What's your problem, soldier?" A few people nearby began to look over at Karen, some with puzzled expressions, while others started to chuckle quietly at her antics. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy thinking that maybe this would finally get the guard to say something. She took a deep breath and then, with a sudden burst of energy, waved her hand right in front of his face, as though she was trying to get a child's attention. Surely this will work, Karen thought. But still, nothing happened. The guard didn't even blink. Feeling more frustrated than ever, Karen folded her arms across her chest and huffed. This is ridiculous. How can anyone be so boring? I bet he's not even a real guard. Probably just a guy in a costume, she muttered to herself. She could hear a few people laughing softly now, and it made her feel like she was the center of attention. She smiled a little at the thought. But then, Karen had an idea. She could do something a little more bold to get him to notice her. After all, no one had ever ignored her this long before. She took a step closer, so close that she could almost feel the coolness of the guard's uniform. She reached out and, with a dramatic flair, tapped his shoulder lightly. "Excuse me, Mr. Guard. You don't mind if I give you a little tap, do you?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Still, the guard did nothing. No reaction, no movement, not even a flinch. He just stood there, as if Karen hadn't even touched him. Karen couldn't believe it. She had tried everything, waving, talking, and even tapping him. But the guard remained as still and silent as before. She looked around at the crowd, hoping to see someone else reacting to her bold moves, but most of the people were now quietly watching, some filming her on their phones, while others stood silently. Karen's face flushed a little. This wasn't going as planned. Karen stood there for a few seconds, feeling a mixture of confusion and frustration. She had done everything she could think of to get the royal guard's attention, but he still hadn't moved. She looked around, hoping to see at least a few people noticing her efforts, but most of the crowd seemed to be looking at her in silence, some with expressions of disapproval. She didn't like being ignored. It was one thing to be ignored by a stranger on the street, but this was a royal guard, a man in an official uniform. She thought to herself, "I'm not going to let him get away with this. No way." With a deep breath, Karen made up her mind. She wasn't going to just stand there quietly and let the guard continue ignoring her. No, this time she was going to make sure he responded. She stepped forward again, even closer this time, until she was standing right in front of him, almost nose to nose. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed loudly, clearly annoyed. "You're just going to stand there and pretend I'm invisible." She threw her hands up in the air for emphasis, as if she was shocked by his behavior. The guard still didn't move. Not a muscle twitched. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, completely locked on the horizon, as if he hadn't even heard her. To him, Karen was just another tourist making noise, but Karen didn't see it that way. She believed she deserved respect, especially from someone in a position of authority like him. With her patience running thin, she decided to take it a step further. She knew the crowd was watching now, and she wasn't going to back down. If he won't react, then I'll just have to make him, Karen thought. She took another deep breath and, in a loud, exaggerated voice, said, "You know, I bet you can't even move. I bet you don't even have the courage to say anything." Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she spoke, hoping the guard would flinch or show some sign of life. A few people in the crowd started to giggle. Karen could hear them. And for a moment, she felt a little pleased. She was finally getting attention. She smiled, thinking that maybe this would be the moment the guard would break his silence and show some weakness. But still, nothing happened. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes locked ahead, unmoving. Karen's smile faded. She wasn't used to being ignored like this, and it was starting to make her feel uncomfortable. Her frustration grew. It was as if the guard wasn't even human. How could anyone stand there so stiff, so unresponsive, without even a glance at her? "Are you deaf or something?" Karen asked, raising her voice even more, hoping to get a reaction. "I'm standing right here." At this point, the crowd was getting restless. Some people were watching her with pity, while others were shaking their heads in disbelief at her behavior. A few were quietly recording the scene on their phones, eager to capture the odd interaction. But Karen didn't care about the crowd. She cared about making the guard react. She was determined to get something, anything, from him, no matter what. Karen stood in front of the royal guard, fuming. Every second that passed without a reaction from him made her more determined. The crowd around her was growing, and some of them were now looking at her, either confused or amused by her efforts to get a response. But Karen wasn't thinking about them. She was only focused on the guard. She leaned in closer, almost inches from his face, and said, "You really think you can just stand there and ignore me all day, don't you? Is that how you do things in the military? Stand around and do nothing?" Her words were loud, cutting through the air. People started to whisper among themselves, some shaking their heads. Karen didn't care. She was frustrated. The guard's lack of response felt like an insult, and she wasn't about to let it go. In a huff, she folded her arms across her chest. She glared at the guard, her face growing redder with each passing moment. Karen wasn't just angry now. She was determined to get this guard to move, to react. She had already waved her hand in front of him, spoken loudly, and even tapped him on the shoulder, but still, nothing. She looked around again, scanning the faces of the crowd, hoping someone would agree with her, but no one said a word. Some people were filming the scene, but most of them were just watching quietly. They were probably wondering if Karen would give up, but she wasn't ready to back down yet. With a dramatic sigh, Karen decided to take things a little further. She stepped back for a moment, just enough to give herself some space. Then, with a smug smile on her face, she said, "If you're really a guard, I should be able to get some kind of reaction from you, right? Maybe you're too scared to move. Maybe you're afraid of being seen as weak." She was speaking louder now, making sure her voice carried through the crowd. A few people nearby exchanged awkward glances. Some shook their heads, while others quietly whispered to each other. But Karen wasn't paying attention to them anymore. She was in the middle of her performance, and there was no turning back. She took a step forward and gave the guard another tap, this time on his uniform. "Come on, move. You don't even know how to respond to a little joke," she taunted, smiling in a way that made her feel superior. At this point, Karen was clearly crossing a line. She was no longer just teasing the guard. She was pushing him, trying to break his calm and control. She felt that if she kept pressing him, eventually he would snap. But what she didn't realize was that the guard wasn't there to entertain her. He was there to do his job. And no matter how much she pushed, he would never break. The crowd around them had gone quiet now, as if waiting for something to happen. A few people looked at each other nervously. It was obvious that Karen's actions were becoming uncomfortable for everyone, but she was too focused on getting a response to notice. Just as Karen thought she had pushed the guard to his limit, something unexpected happened. The royal guard, who had been standing completely still for what felt like an eternity, suddenly made a movement. But it wasn't what Karen was expecting. With one powerful stomp, the guard's boots hit the ground, making a sharp, loud sound that echoed through the crowd. The sudden noise startled Karen, and she jumped back, her heart racing. The people around her went quiet, and the tension in the air was thick. The guard's voice, deep and commanding, broke the silence. "Stand Baski," he bellowed, his words booming with authority. Karen's eyes widened in shock. She had never expected the guard to speak, let alone raise his voice like that. The sound of his words was powerful, almost like a warning, and it immediately caught the attention of everyone around them. The crowd, which had been quietly watching Karen's antics, now stood in stunned silence. People shifted uncomfortably, some looking at each other with surprised expressions. No one had expected the royal guard to respond like this. Karen, still recovering from the sudden outburst, found herself momentarily speechless. She had been so sure that she could make the guard react. But now, standing face to face with him, she realized how wrong she had been. Did you just yell at me?" she stammered, her voice shaky. The confidence she had felt moments before quickly began to fade. The royal guard's expression remained unchanged. His eyes were fixed ahead, and his posture was as rigid as ever. He didn't seem bothered by Karen's questions or her behavior. To him, this was just another part of his duty, another day of standing watch without letting anything distract him. Karen opened her mouth to speak again, but the guard cut her off with a steady, unwavering voice. "You have crossed a line. I suggest you move back and allow me to continue my duties." His words were calm but firm, carrying the weight of his authority. The people around them were watching intently, many of them now starting to feel uncomfortable with the situation. Some tourists had begun to pull out their phones, eager to capture the moment. It was clear that Karen's attempt to get a reaction from the guard was not going the way she had planned. Karen hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had expected the guard to either ignore her or show some sign of weakness. Instead, he had responded with such strength and discipline that it left her momentarily speechless. The confidence she had felt before seemed to slip away, replaced by a sense of embarrassment. The guard, unmoved by her discomfort, remained still. It was as if nothing had happened, as if Karen's attempts to provoke him had been nothing more than a passing distraction. The crowd, now growing even more quiet, watched as Karen slowly took a step back. She could feel their eyes on her, and she realized that she had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. A few people whispered among themselves, some laughing quietly, while others simply shook their heads at the situation. Karen, now feeling humiliated, stood in stunned silence for a moment. She had pushed too far, and now she had nowhere to go but backward. Karen stood there, completely stunned. The royal guard had finally reacted, and it wasn't in the way she had imagined. His voice had been loud, strong, and filled with authority, and it made her feel small. She had expected him to flinch, to show some kind of weakness, but instead he had done the opposite. He had spoken with power and confidence, and it caught her off guard. Her mind raced. What just happened? She thought, her heart still pounding. She had always prided herself on being able to control situations, to be the one in charge. But now, in front of this calm and unwavering guard, she felt out of control. The crowd around her was still silent, watching her every move. Karen could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Some people were whispering, while others were looking at her with expressions of disbelief. A few even had their phones out, filming the scene, capturing the awkward moment for the world to see. Karen's face turned bright red. She could feel the heat of embarrassment rushing to her cheeks. She had been so sure of herself, so confident that she could make the guard react. But now she realized how wrong she had been. Did you really have to shout at me like that?" Karen finally managed to say, her voice much softer than before. She was no longer the loud, demanding person who had first approached the guard. Now she was trying to make sense of the situation, but her words didn't sound as confident as they had earlier. The guard didn't respond. He didn't need to. His posture remained perfect, his eyes straight ahead, focused on his duty. It was clear that nothing would shake him. He had done his job, and Karen had pushed too far. Karen took a step back, her body tense. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and it made her even more uncomfortable. The laughter that had started to spread through the people around her made her stomach turn. She had become the center of attention, but not in the way she had wanted. She glanced around, hoping to find someone who would agree with her, someone who would see things from her point of view. But instead, she saw the amused faces of the tourists, and a few of them even chuckled quietly. Karen swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. She had never felt so humiliated in her life. She had tried to get a reaction from the royal guard, but all she had achieved was making herself look foolish. Her husband, who had been standing quietly behind her, finally spoke up. "Karen, maybe we should just move on. It's clear he's not going to engage with you." His voice was calm, almost apologetic, but Karen could hear the slight hint of embarrassment in it too. She nodded slowly, her face still flushed. Maybe he's right, she thought. She had made a scene, and now it was time to walk away. But as she turned to leave, she could feel the eyes of the crowd still on her. She had wanted attention, But this wasn't the kind of attention she had hoped for. Karen slowly walked away from the guard, her head down. She could hear a few people whispering and laughing behind her, but she didn't turn around. She just wanted to get away from the awkward situation she had created. As she moved through the crowd, Karen couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just happened. She had pushed too hard, and now she was the one who had been put in her place. As Karen walked away from the royal guard, she felt a mixture of shame and frustration. Her face was still red, and her steps felt heavier with each moment. She had tried to make a scene, to get the guard to react, but now it felt like the whole crowd was watching her every move. The laughter and whispers she had heard earlier echoed in her mind, making her stomach twist with embarrassment. Her husband, who had stayed close behind her, was now holding his camera, looking at the ground. He didn't say anything, but Karen could tell he was just as uncomfortable as she was. She had thought she could have some fun with the royal guard, but now she realized how wrong she had been. Her attempt to make him flinch had backfired in a way she hadn't expected. As she moved farther away from the guard, Karen saw two security officers approaching. They walked toward her with calm, purposeful steps. The crowd parted slightly as they passed, and Karen's heart skipped a beat. She knew something wasn't right. The officers, dressed in formal uniforms, were looking directly at her. One of them, a tall man with a serious expression, stopped in front of Karen. He glanced at her for a moment before speaking in a calm but firm voice. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you." Karen's eyes widened in surprise. "What about?" she asked, her voice still a little shaky. She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? The officer continued, "You were causing a disturbance earlier. We've had reports about your behavior toward the royal guard. We need to ask you to leave the area." Karen blinked. She wasn't expecting this. "But I wasn't doing anything wrong," she protested. "I was just joking with him. It's not like I did anything serious." The officer shook his head. "What you did was disruptive. The royal guards are here to protect the palace, and it is not appropriate to interfere with their duties. They are highly trained and must stay focused. We ask that you respect their role." Karen felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her again. She had never considered that her actions could have caused any harm. She had only wanted to get the guard's attention, but now it was clear that she had crossed a line. As the officer continued speaking, Karen realized that the situation was much more serious than she had thought. The royal guards weren't there to entertain her or anyone else. They were there to do an important job. And by trying to get a reaction out of one of them, she had disrespected that job. The officer gave her a stern look. "We need you to leave, ma'am. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we may have to take further action." Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't used to being told what to do. She had always believed that she was in control of every situation. But now, standing in front of the security officers, she realized that she wasn't the one in charge here. She had pushed too far, and now she was paying the price. Her husband, who had been quietly standing by, spoke up. "Karen, maybe it's time to go. They're just doing their job." Karen sighed, feeling her anger turn into frustration. "Fine," she muttered. She was embarrassed, and she didn't want to cause more trouble. As she turned to leave, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her once again. This time, there was no laughter. There was only silence, and it made her feel small. She walked away slowly, her shoulders slumped, realizing that her attempt to make a scene had only led to her own humiliation. As Karen and her husband walked away from the royal guard and the security officers, the weight of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. She felt embarrassed, her pride bruised, and her mind racing with the events that had unfolded. The crowd that had been watching her every move seemed to grow quieter, and Karen couldn't help but feel the sting of their judgment. But little did she know, the whole scene wasn't over. The people in the crowd had been quietly recording the entire interaction on their phones. What had started as a small disturbance had now turned into a viral moment, one that would soon be shared across the internet. By the time Karen and her husband had walked out of the palace area and into the nearby streets, the first video had already been posted online. A group of tourists who had been nearby had uploaded the footage, and within minutes it was spreading like wildfire. People were commenting, sharing, and reacting to what they had just witnessed. The video showed Karen waving her hand in front of the royal guard, mocking him, and trying everything she could to get a reaction. The loud stomp of the guard's boots and his powerful command, "Stand back," was captured clearly. The camera even caught Karen's shocked expression as she stumbled backward in surprise. At first, the video got a few views, but as the hours passed, it began to gain traction. People shared it with their friends, laughed about it in the comments, and even made jokes about Karen's attempt to challenge the guard. The video was soon picked up by a few popular social media pages, and before Karen knew it, it was everywhere. The comments came flooding in. Some people were mocking Karen for thinking she could get the guard to react. Others were applauding the guard's professionalism and discipline. But the most surprising part for Karen was seeing how many people were laughing at her expense. One comment read, "This is why you should never mess with royal guards. They're not here to entertain you." Another one said, "Karen thought she could get away with embarrassing a guard, but the guard had the last laugh." The video had even been shared by several news outlets, and by the end of the day, it had gone viral. Karen was sitting in the hotel room, scrolling through her phone when she started seeing the comments and the shares. Her stomach sank. "No, this can't be happening," she muttered under her breath as she watched the video for the first time. She could hardly believe it. The laughter, the comments, the memes, it was all so much more than she had ever expected. She had been the joke, and now it was clear to her that she had made a huge mistake. Her husband, who had been quiet up until now, looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. "Karen, you've really made a scene. People are talking about you all over the internet." Karen felt her cheeks flush with even more embarrassment. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the one who made others laugh or react. But now she was the one everyone was laughing at. She had become a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. A few hours later, the video was still trending. The hashtag Karen's Guard was everywhere. Some people were even creating funny memes, turning her actions into jokes that would be shared for days to come. Karen sat in her chair, staring at her phone. She had never imagined this would happen. She had tried to get a reaction, but now she was the one who had been exposed to the world, and all she could do was watch as her embarrassment played out on every screen. The next day, Karen woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She groggily reached over and picked it up, still feeling the weight of everything that had happened the day before. As her eyes flickered open, she saw the hundreds of notifications on her screen. The video had exploded across social media, and she couldn't escape it. The comments were still pouring in. Some were kind, but most were making jokes about her. People had posted screenshots of her shocked face when the royal guard had finally spoken, and others had turned the moment into memes that were shared all over the internet. "Look at the face of someone who just realized they messed with the wrong person," one comment read, followed by a laughing emoji. Karen felt her stomach turn. She never thought her small prank would turn into something so huge. The more she scrolled, the more embarrassed she felt. Everywhere she looked, people were laughing at her. It felt like she had become the punchline of a joke that everyone knew but her. Her husband, who had been silent the entire morning, finally spoke up as he sat next to her. "Karen, I think you need to take this down a notch. This is bigger than you realize. You really upset some people yesterday." Karen sighed, dropping her phone onto the bed. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she muttered. "I just wanted to have a little fun. I didn't think he would react like that." Her husband gave her a sympathetic look. "Well, he did his job. And now you've got a lot of people who think you went too far." For a moment, Karen sat there, staring at the screen. She thought about the royal guard's professionalism. He had stood his ground, never flinching or getting upset. He had done his job as he was supposed to, and in doing so, he had gained respect from the crowd. Karen, on the other hand, had made herself look foolish. She began to think about what she could learn from all of this. Maybe it was time to reflect on her actions. Maybe she had overstepped in her attempt to get attention. She had always prided herself on being outspoken, but now she realized that there was a fine line between having fun and disrespecting others. Karen thought back to the moments before the guard had spoken. She had tried to provoke him, but he had remained calm and composed. That was something she could admire. His response wasn't about getting back at her. It was about maintaining his discipline, his duty, and his respect for the position he held. She glanced at her phone again, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could delete the video, but it was already out there. It was already too late. The damage had been done. But Karen realized that maybe this could be an opportunity for growth. Maybe she could own up to her mistake and learn from it. Maybe she could share a post, not to make excuses, but to simply admit that she had overdone it. Karen sighed, feeling the weight of the lesson she had learned. It wasn't easy, but she knew she had to change her approach. She wasn't always going to be the one in control, and sometimes letting others do their job without interference was the best way to show respect. A few days later, Karen posted a simple message on her social media account, apologizing to the Royal Guard and acknowledging her behavior. The comments were mixed, but she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't about getting attention anymore. It was about owning up to her actions and learning from them. As the days passed, the video eventually faded from the public eye, but the lesson Karen had learned stayed with her. She realized that sometimes the best way to learn was through the consequences of your actions, and although the experience had been embarrassing, it had taught her to think before she acted and to show respect for others, even those who seemed untouchable.